This episode of the Vincast is brought to you in part by Different Drop, an online wine retailer based in Sydney, focusing on Australian wines made with love, care, and attention by some really up-and-coming, a lot of the time innovative and sustainable grape growers and winemakers around the country. If you go to Different Drop, you'll find a huge selection of wines from a multitude of different varieties, covering lots of different regions around Australia. And you'll be able to find some wines that you can't really secure that easily in the big chain retail stores. Many of the former guests of the podcast, as well as I'm sure many future guests of the podcast, have their wines available through Different Drop. And it's a great way for you to kind of follow up your experience of listening to the podcast, hearing the stories of the guest, and then enjoying their wines. And it's a great way to support them and also to support the podcast. So if you go to differentdrop.com/intrepidwino, you'll find a little secret section where you'll find some little packs from some of the guests of the podcast. And if you make sure to please use the code INTREPIDWINO at purchase, the guys at Different Drop will give you a bonus. And it's great to have the support of Different Drop guys. And thank you again for listening to this episode. On episode 65 of the Vincast, I chat with Vinea Marson, one of the most respected viticulturists in Victoria and the man behind Vinea Marson wines from Heathcote and beyond. We chat about his background, his experiences, and working at Mount Mary. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Gassbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and it's great to have you on for another week. And I hope you enjoyed the special sort of double episode last week, chatting with a couple of young up-and-coming winemakers. And, you know, as a bit of contrast for this week, I've got someone who has many, many years of experience in the Australian wine industry. But before we get on to this week's episode, I just want to let you know that I'm not sure if you've seen any of the Let's Taste videos that I've been posting onto YouTube, or indeed any of the Let's Taste live episodes that I've had with a couple of former guests of the podcast. But on 28th of September, I'm going to be hosting a Let's Taste live of Australian Riesling. Picked 6 Rieslings from around the country, all quite different expressions, but all dry styles. And so we're going to be tasting those live. And I've got a special guest in mind. I'm not going to confirm as yet because I need to hear back from them, but it's going to be fantastic. So make sure you go to my YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino, and you'll find the live event there, and you can set a reminder for yourself to join us at 6:30 p.m. But yeah, it's going to be lots of fun. You can actually buy the wines from Different Drop. Make sure you go to differentdrop.com/intrepidwino, and you'll get a 6-pack of those bottles. So you and your friends or family, whoever, can actually open those bottles and taste along live and ask questions and maybe make some comments. So I hope to have you on board. So as I mentioned, for this week, I've got Vinea Marson on the podcast, who has worked in the Australian wine industry for many, many years, as well as some vintages overseas and done a bit of travelling as well. So he came on to talk about his experiences and his philosophies and how he expresses his wines in Vinea Marson. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you on the other side. Mario, thank you very much for joining me here in the Vincast studio, and welcome.
Thank you.
I usually start every episode, as my listeners would know, asking my guest if they remember what their first interaction with wine was that actually sort of set them on the path of wanting to follow a career, or more accurately, a life in wine.
Look, wine's always been part of my life. I can remember as a small child that wine was always served with a meal. And,
yes.
Even though it was served, it was watered down. So there's half a glass of water, and that was topped up with wine. So
okay.
They're my first recollections of wine.
That sounds kind of Germanic, actually. I mean, they typically would do it with I think a sparkling water, but Where does that kind of tradition come from? Or is that
Oh,
just something you did that was done in your family?
look, my parents came from northern Italy, and so wine's always been part of their culture, so to speak. Both my grandfathers had vineyards.
Really?
Yes.
Whereabouts?
In Friuli in northeastern Italy, up in that top northeastern corner, close to Slovenia, or it was Yugoslavia then, but Slovenia.
Before that, it was Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yes. And so even with my surname being Marson, it's not a very Italian-sounding surname, and my mother's maiden name is Zaget, which is even weirder, so to speak. But we've always had that culture of wine in our family, so to speak.
Were you born in Australia?
Yes, I was born in Australia.
Whereabouts?
Melbourne.
Okay.
So,
was it your parents who migrated, and had they met overseas and come together, or did they meet here?
No, they were married overseas. Dad came out in 1951 and Mum followed a year later in 1952. And so Dad, I think some of his early work was in concreting. And
Classic Italian.
Yeah, exactly. And at the time, just before the...
It wasn't concrete shoes, was it? And dropping in Port Phillip Bay?
Not that I know of.
It's possible.
Who knows? But no, Dad helped, did a lot of work out at the Olympic Village at Heidelberg.
Ah, not far from where I grew up.
Yeah, so there you go. So doing concreting in the village, so to speak.
And so as far as sort of watering down the wine, was that, like when you were young, did you get the opportunity to try some wine as well?
Oh, yes, I did. It was mainly all homemade wine. So Dad was always making his own wine at that time of the year in autumn, and so
in Damigiana, was it? It was in Demijohns?
Yes. No, he got some old barrels. But one of my earliest recollections was that we used to get wine shipped over from Patriti in McLaren Vale. And we'd bottle up a keg. It would have, I don't think it was quite 225 litres, but it was a decent size. Yeah. So maybe a half barrique or something like that. And so it was all bottled up into clean beer bottles and then, put a Stelvin beer top on top of it. Yeah. So...
just table wine type
stuff. Yes, it was just for home.
So classic Italian.
Exactly.
Sort of. And as far as the kind of food you had when you were growing up, was that quite classically Friulian?
Well, yes. Some of my earliest recollections is once a year that a butcher would come around with a pig in 4 quarters, and you'd spend the day. That was a day that you didn't have to go to school, so you made all the salami, the sausages, the cotechino, and the rest of it. So that was always a great day. Long day, but, fantastic.
And as far as sort of education and then as a young adult, what kind of path were you heading down?
Well, my path, even though Dad had always made his wine, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so... in my final years at school, I decided I liked botany and that sort of area. And so I inquired about that at the universities, and one of the other courses I saw was agricultural science, and that's where I always enjoyed that, and so I got into agriculture. I did agricultural science at La Trobe University, and so... Was it the study of agriculture or being in nature that you kind of... Or was it both? It was always a bit of both, and look, half of... I grew up in Balwyn, and half of Dad's backyard was converted to a veggie patch. That was going to be my next question. So we grew all our own vegetables as such, and there was also vines that he planted in there, and so that was part of the fruit that he got to make his own wine. But he always used to buy a lot of fruit in to help make it as well. Mm-hmm. As far as the agricultural science course, where was that? La Trobe University. Okay, and what was that like? Look, that was good. It's a very general course, and it introduces you to plant soil sciences, animal husbandry, microbiology, and the economic side of things, and also computing. So
Okay.
it's quite a broad-based course.
But at the same time, a fantastic base for future
Exactly,
stuff. Okay.
exactly. And see, in third year, we're given the option of selecting subjects that we might want to pursue in fourth year. And so I did a lot of research subjects in viticulture and enology, and I did my research project on grapevine roots. And
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, which was brought me out into the Yarra Valley, and I did it.
What sort of research did that entail?
I was trying to determine the actual time that root development or new root development occurred in relation to bud burst.
Ah, okay.
So it meant a lot of destructive root sampling and working back from there. But that's how I met Jeff Godden and also Gilda Puri at Yeringberg. So
Right, okay.
I used some of his vines to take some core samples and took the roots back and washed them and tried to work out when the root primordia initiated in relation to bud burst.
Roughly when was this?
It would have been 1980.
Okay.
Yes, 1980.
There was a little bit, I mean, that obviously is, well, a little bit after the kind of rebirth of the Yarra Valley.
Yes.
But there still wasn't huge investment in the Yarra Valley yet.
Exactly. Well, look, there were some passionate people that had started working in the Yarra Valley. Pete Ferguson at Ferguson's, and then there was Mount Mary, Yeringberg, Dr. Peter McMahon at Seville Estate, and St Hubert's. They were some of the major ones.
Bailey Caritas?
Yes, I'd forgotten Bailey. I'm just trying to remember all of them.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it was sort of part kind of hobby farm, part
yes,
sort of, historic, I suppose. The Dupury family had been there for a long time and, re-establishing, the vineyard there.
That's right. Well, it was in the late 60s that occurred, and
Sure.
Bailey Caritas was one of the first ones to do that. And the other one I've forgotten about was Reg Egan at One Turner Estate.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
So, but they were the main ones that started that rebirth in the Yarra Valley.
Yes. So, as far as you were, did you go to a couple of different places to kind of get some sample material?
I only went to Yeringberg because I just wanted to use one vine,
Sure.
or in one row,
Sure.
and just take take all the root samples from that one vine and then work back from there.
Yeah.
And so Gil gave me some of his Shiraz vines, which he later pulled out to do some work on.
Oh, okay. So, you followed a path that ended up in kind of viticulture?
Well, I was keen to get into viticulture, and after I graduated, which would have been early February, I just drove around to some of the wineries in the Yarra Valley asking if there was any work.
Yeah.
And so, the day that I turned up at St Hubert's, the vineyard manager just handed his resignation in that day.
There you go.
So it was good timing on my part.
Fortuitous.
Yes.
So, what were the early experiences like? Working out in the vineyard and actually sort of seeing, a full year of the changes in the vine and that kind of thing.
Well, it was. I was mainly working out in the vineyard, and so it was a pretty big introduction into viticulture in a very short space of time. I was there, I think, helped out with the 81 vintage, and then sort of took over the running of the vineyard. But it was quite a daunting task when you've got 40 acres of vines post vintage to start pruning, and not having done that sort of work before.
Sure.
So it was a challenge.
So I would think that your knowledge was obviously very theoretical. So yeah, you probably had to do a lot of learning by doing. And were you talking? Did you sort of get advice from some of the other sort of people out in the vines?
Well, there was a lot of advice that I got through the old Department of Agriculture. They had quite a good, extensive viticultural extension program at that stage. At the time, Alex White, Martin Grinsberg and David Lance were the winemakers at St Hubert, so I gained a lot of knowledge from those guys while I was working there. And then I think in the second year of my work there, I enrolled in the wine style. Initially, it was the viticulture course at Charles Sturt University, or the old Wagga Institute before that.
Yeah.
So that's how it got me going in that area.
With the idea of doing it by correspondence or like
Yes.
by distance?
Yes, I was doing it by correspondence.
Sure.
And so it was
Quite
quite
interesting back then. It was obviously long before the internet.
Yes, it was more challenging, and Australia Post was the main method of moving notes, etc. So very different to today.
So how long did you end up working at St Hubert's?
I was only there at St Hubert's for about 2 years, and it was through one of the guys that I met up at Wagga that said to me, Mario, if you ever want to learn about winemaking, this is the place, meaning Mount Mary. And so I happened to apply for his position and was lucky enough to get the job. So I started off there in 1983, which wasn't a great year. And with the bushfires that we had, Ash Wednesday, I can remember working out in the vineyard and there was ash falling into the vineyard. And so we didn't really know a lot about smoky taint at those stages. So it was one of those things that we found out about.
But I guess it would have been pretty amazing as far as learning about winemaking at an environment like Mount Mary, where you're actually taking, from start to finish. It's more of that vigneron style of thing rather than, okay, here's your fruit, now make your wine.
Oh, very much so. So it was a great learning experience, and I gained a lot of knowledge from working for John in those early years.
Yeah. How long did you end up spending at Mount Mary?
Well, I had 2 stints at Mount Mary because I was there from 83 till 86, and then I left in 86, did 2 vintages at Long Gully out near Hillsville, where I set up the winery there. And then in 89, I returned back to Mount Mary. So that was where I took over more the day-to-day running of the winery for John. At that stage, so did 10 vintages there.
Did you get the opportunity to sort of visit other wine regions outside of the Yarra Valley and kind of learn a little bit about, other climates and perhaps other varieties as well?
I did have a lot of visits to other wine regions. But I think one of the main experiences was when I did the 94 vintage in Burgundy.
Okay.
But
how did you get that opportunity?
I'd met Nicolas Potel, whose father ran Domaine de la Pousse-d'Or, and so
I've been there.
Yeah, so yeah, great place, and great domain as
Very
well.
cool setup.
Yes. But Gerard passed away in 96, I think, and so I haven't been back there since.
I think it got bought from memory, I was there in 2010, it got bought by, I think, an engineer, and he kind of introduced a little bit of his sort of background as an engineer in the cellars as far as the winemaking, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, I haven't. Yes, I'll have to take your word for it. No, but
how was the 96 vintage in Burgundy?
It was 94.
Sorry, 94.
94 wasn't a great year, but I learned a lot from poor years because it had been fantastic up until September. It was quite dry, just good ripening conditions, and then it started raining in September. And so my recollections of Burgundy was seeing an Australian in shorts when it's only 10 or 11 degrees. And I quickly learnt to buy a pair of jeans so that I could overcome that.
Sure.
But it was mainly spent on the sorting table
Okay.
and removing any botrytis on fruit that you might see.
Sounds a bit like the 2014 vintage.
Possibly, yes. So, but it was just seeing, and also just seeing the amount of stalks that they might incorporate. But, with the ripeness of the fruit, and stalks is decreased. But they mainly did that with their monopole vineyards that I noticed.
Sure.
And it was stalks that, whether it was Clos de la Pustor, and then also the Soissons Ouvray, that the other monopole, and there were stalks introduced in the better year. In the better years, you could, if the stalks were ripe, they would introduce up to 15% of stalks in those under those circumstances.
The fruit, the ripeness would have been there to sort of offset the
Yes.
increase in stalks, I would think.
Yes, exactly.
So was that something that you kind of came back and started to sort of think about introducing into like Mount Mary, or were you still at Mount Mary at that point?
Yes, I was still at Mount Mary. There were things that we'd mainly had cultured yeast that we're using at Mount Mary, and it was interesting working with natural ferments, and so from that point of view, I quite enjoyed that. And even though we still use the cultivated yeast, we used much lower rates of inoculation.
Sure.
And so to slowly mimic that natural fermentation process. And so there's some of the things that we did use, but techniques that were used. But I also saw that it was really important to get oxygen into those ferments at an early stage.
What do you think is the benefit of that?
Well, it tends to build up the yeast cell wall, and so it helps in that process and makes it much more. Well, it makes the yeast stronger, so it can cope with those anaerobic conditions further down the fermentation pathway.
Okay.
And I'd also seen that in Italy, but more so in 2003 that I did notice that.
So you at some point had you travelled to Italy before that?
Yes, I'd. Before I went to Burgundy, I was in Italy because I've got a lot of my grandparents. 93. My grandmother was still alive, and so I stayed with my grandmother. But then travelled to Friuli and Tuscany and Piemonte or Piedmont on those visits.
Visiting wineries?
Yes.
How was your Italian?
It's pretty good. It's I spent, when I was 21, I spent 12 months over there. So,
okay.
Coming from Australia, I mainly spoke the dialect or the local dialect.
Sure.
And you tend to bastardise certain words in that are English words and make them sound like Italian words.
That's what I've heard.
And so it was a good experience that taught me to speak proper Italian, and so that helped. And so yes, I can get by.
And what were your impressions visiting wineries in Italy?
I really liked the different varieties that you could, Italian varieties. In Friuli, you've got a lot of Merlot and Cabernet Franc that's grown in that area.
Sure.
Whereas the whites, apart from the international varieties like Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, then you've got lesser varieties of Pinot Bianco, and then more Italian varieties, Friulano, Piccolit, Malvasia di Istria. And so they were very different to me, very different texturally. And then you go down to Tuscany and you've got the home of Sangiovese. And so they're sort of quite large berried varieties, but I think at that time you could see that they were starting to do some work into reducing the cropping levels of those varieties, and working in that sort of way to do it. And I was lucky enough to meet Paolo De Marchi on one of those visits, and so I had a great introduction to some of the Chiantis and Chianti Classico and his Ceparello at that stage.
Yeah, it's an amazing estate.
Oh, it's,
Like just the buildings on that site, I could not believe it. I was like, wow, I've never seen anything like this before.
No, it was, I think in '94, fantastic to visit there and just to watch, because I did vintage in 2003 with Paolo. And,
really? Okay.
And so I saw the old winery, and in 2003 saw the new winery.
Yes.
And so that was fantastic.
2003 would have been a challenging vintage.
It was, because I only had a small amount of time. I'd missed the bulk of the Sangiovese in Tuscany, but I went to...
It would have ripened very early.
It was very early. And you could see the difference and understand by limiting the amount of fruit that was produced. It came off very quickly. The cropping levels were very low, and so from that point of view, it ripened very quickly. Whereas the more traditional grape growers, you could see that they still had a lot of fruit on, and so you could see how if you manage the cropping level of those vines, yes, they will ripen earlier, but you get that intensity and richness in those wines. And that was a good experience for me when I did see that as well.
So in terms of traveling, into different regions in Italy and then spending a bit of time in France, did you kind of think a lot about, okay, I've learned, bits and pieces here. I've kind of seen a different terroir or terreno that each place has. This is how I think we can apply this kind of knowledge and understanding in Australia, and sort of thinking about, okay, even in Victoria we have different regions, and perhaps there are ways that we can improve.
Oh yes, undoubtedly. That's what it taught me. And look, I've used a general rule that reds like clay soils, and whites, it's good to have a bit of rock in the vineyard so you get that minerality coming through. And they're just two very general rules that I've looked at. In Tuscany, you've got the galestro, which is a rock that breaks down, but there's also that clay component, which is very important there as well. In Friuli, depending on the region, you've got
The Ponca.
Ponca, exactly.
Collio.
In Collio, but when you're also down near where Schiopetto is, you've got there are old alluvial glacial beds, and so you've got this rock mixed in with the soil, and they're general things that I've taken back with me, and it's also I think when you look at sites, you look at it from the point of view, you look at what vegetation's growing there and how it's growing, and I think that's always a good indication of what sort of plants can grow there. And so maybe that's going back to my agricultural science days, because I was always looking on the ground, mainly because I had to make a grass collection, and so you're always observing those sort of different terrains and small climate changes that you might see.
Do you ascribe to the benefits of biodiversity?
Oh yes, I think biodiversity is really important. Admittedly, in viticulture, you're just working with a monoculture basically, but you've also got what grasses and weeds are growing there, and they're also good indications of what is important to support that natural flora and that might be present there as well.
So you talked about helping establish Long Gully in the Yarra Valley. Did you have any other experience as far as helping establish other sites or other wineries?
Well, Long Gully was mainly planted by the time I arrived there, and so I helped with setting up the winery. I was always quite keen to try different varieties, and I think Mount Mary opened me up to seeing different varieties. When I worked at Mount Mary, there was Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot, Cabernet Franc, and so these were, if you look at it in the early mid-80s, there was very few of those varieties grown around that at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. It was mainly Riesling and Shiraz that were the predominant varieties in the Australian viticultural industry.
Mm-hmm. How things have changed.
They have indeed, which is great. It gives the drinking public that diversity and different styles to actually try, which is fantastic.
So when did you sort of start to think about kind of, as it were, putting down your own roots and possibly planting a vineyard for yourself and thinking about that kind of future?
Well, I think that experience in '94 got me thinking about doing something for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always enjoyed Sangiovese, and having tasted a lot of Ceparelos, I probably saw the advantage of growing Sangiovese, and having spoken to Paolo at length about it, and explaining a few of the characteristics of the variety, and trying to understand it. That's when I first started looking around, mainly around Victoria, because I just thought I'd love to somewhere fairly close to Melbourne.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, and looking at climatically, Yarra Valley was probably a little bit too cool in those times for it, because it does need an extended period of ripening, because it is a naturally high acid variety, and so you need that extra period in autumn without the rains to get the fruit ripe. And so
I think the valley floor these days would be okay for Sangiovese.
I agree. I agree.
With climate change.
Yes. I think that I've noticed coming back to the valley that it has changed quite a deal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can remember my experiences through the 80s and 90s that Pinot used to be harvested in March and towards the end of March, whereas now it's mid-February.
Sure.
Most of the time. So
I remember when I was working at Shandon, winemakers talking about, oh man, remember the good old days where you'd be really excited to actually be finished before Easter. Now and then it was just like we're well and truly finished before Easter.
Oh my word! Easter's, and if it's a late Easter, we've usually got a fair amount of the wines into wood as well.
Sure.
So it's one of those things that that we have noticed the effect of climate change.
So tell me about the site that you ended up choosing to plant some Sangiovese.
When I started looking north of the divide,
Mm-hmm.
and so I went to 3 areas which I thought would probably be suitable: Bendigo,
Mm-hmm.
Heathcote, and Nagambie, around there.
Mm-hmm.
Bendigo I thought was probably a little bit too cool at that time, and I sort of looked at Heathcote as being better areas for those varieties at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And in '99 we bought a property at Heathcote, so we settled on Heathcote. I really liked the structure and the character that you were getting in those Cambrian soils. And so we bought a property and started a big adventure.
And you didn't just plant Sangiovese?
No, I planted Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, Shiraz, a little bit of Viognier. I've also put in some Refosco del Peduncolo Rosso, a little bit of Barbera, just to see how it would go. And since then, I've put in Canaiolo Nero and I'm just trying to think of the other variety. A little bit of Colorino as well. So
classic
Chianti.
Chianti.
Yes, exactly.
Blending variety.
Yes, very much so.
So how long were you kind of playing around with things, and eventually, after a few years, you got sort of fruit to actually make some wine from? And when did you kind of start to think, oh, this wine, I think we could actually sort of bottle and start selling this?
Well, we planted the vineyard in 2000, so which is year zero, so to speak, and so it makes it
good place to start.
It makes it quite handy just to remember the age of the vines.
Yeah.
And then we didn't get a crop until 2004 was our first vintage.
Okay.
And after learning experiences of being a grape grower, of problems that you might have in trying to establish a vineyard, but all through the 2000s, we went into that sort of 10 years of drought period, so it was quite challenging to get these vines up and running. But Shiraz seems to like that heat, and so it was quite comfortable in providing good quality fruit from that vineyard. All through all my experiences at Mount Mary, I've learnt that the use of different clones and also the use of different varieties in a wine is really important. And so with Sangiovese, I think I've got about 10 or 12 clones of Sangiovese, and more so the newer clones that were brought into the country. So I've got a whole mixture of clones that I use, and also the same with Nebbiolo. I've probably haven't got quite as many. I've only got about 10 of those, but it's just seeing the differences that might occur. And I think I've got about 4 or 5 clones of Shiraz and 2 clones of Viognier as well.
So from that Heathcote vineyard, you're now making, is it 4 wines?
Yes. Well, 3 wines are no. You're right. 4 wines, because I make a Syrah, Shiraz Viognier, Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, and a Viognier from that. The other wine that comes from the Heathcote region is the Rosé.
Okay.
I buy Sangiovese in for that, and there's also a little bit of bleed off from the Nebbiolo that I blend back with it.
And you eventually added a couple of other wines to the range from there, but they're not from Heathcote, are they?
No, they're from the Alpine Valleys, up near at Paulpunka, near Bright. So
reasonably high up and away from the coast, and so cool, very cool nights.
Yes, cool nights. The days can get quite warm as well. I had a friend of mine that had the property up there, and he had a vineyard when he was looking at purchasing it. And he, after a couple of years, he wanted to plant some white varieties, and he asked me what to plant. And I said, well, try Prosecco for a start, and then I rattled off Pinot Bianco, Malvasia d'Istria, Picolit, and Tocai Friulano. And he sort of looked at me as though, I've never heard of these varieties. What are they, Mario? So I explained to Neil what these varieties were, and
how important they were to you.
Yes,
coming from Friuli.
Yes. And so that he was game enough to plant them, and I've been making wine from them since 2011.
And there's there now 2 different Prosecco wines. So you make there's a white, which is like a Friulian blend, of all those varieties, and then there was the Prosecco. But I think you've been toying with something a little bit more recently that sort of possibly caused up a little bit of fuss on Twitter over in Italy.
I think even the name Prosecco in Italy is something that will cause a lot of fuss.
Yeah, that's true.
But I've also left because most of the wine, all of the wine this year was bottle fermented.
Sure.
I've left about 20 dozen on lees, and In Italy, it's called col fondo, which
Yes.
means with the lees, basically.
Yes.
And so I've just left it like that and seen how the reception to it would be.
Well, I think I tried one of the first ones, didn't I?
Yes, yeah, I
And
think you did.
I found it really interesting because the texture of the wine is quite different. You know, when you still have that lees in the bottle, and I actually found it to be more mineral in that way
Yes,
because you're
yes.
picking up more of that kind of natural yeast lees build up from the wine itself, rather than having it removed and having a sort of a natural filtration of that kind of element. When you're leaving it in, for me, it kind of has that mineral texture to it.
I think yeast does have that texture to it, and
Sure.
it's been a while since I've tasted one of those bottles, so maybe now's the right opportunity.
Well, now the sun's come back out and it's a bit warmer.
Exactly. But I found that Prosecco can be quite an austere variety, and sugar's always used to give it a bit more body. I've added a very small portion of Pinot Bianco to it, just to give it a bit more texture to it as well. So,
Okay. Bit of weight.
yes, it just not too much, but it just helps to fill out the mid palate and give it a bit of body, so to speak.
But you're also involved with another project back in the Yarra Valley.
Yes. I'm now working for a Chinese company called Sunshine Creek, and I'm chief winemaker for all their ventures in Australia. We've got a 55-acre vineyard where we use the fruit off that to put into an estate range, and I buy a little bit of fruit in the Heathcote region to make an estate Shiraz, and so I'm making 4 wines for them, and then I sort of responsible for acquiring other grapes to make a cheaper price wine for them as well.
Is that just going into the Chinese market though?
Yes, it all goes just about. There's a small percentage which is kept for the Australian market, but the bulk of it does go over to China.
And it just sort of shows you what's happening in the Chinese market, that there's some maturity and investment, I guess, from China in more wine, whether it's within China, because obviously they're making heaps of their own wine now, but also, overseas. I know they're buying up, estates and vineyards in Europe as well.
Yes, mainly in Bordeaux. I don't...
The Burgundians are all paranoid. They're paranoid that the Chinese are going to start buying all the estates in Burgundy.
I can understand that, but I think it's much easier in Bordeaux because they know they can see the vineyard, and for the Chinese to understand that you only might get 2 or 3 rows of certain vineyards in Burgundy, it's quite a different concept to grasp.
From stories that I've heard from estates in France, particularly in Burgundy, Chinese customers coming and tasting something and going, okay, I want a container of that. And it's like, I don't make, like, my total production isn't even a container. What are you talking about?
That was my first experience with the Chinese because, admittedly, if you have a sale of a pallet of wine, you think, oh, this is fantastic. But when they start talking about containers, it's a totally different concept. And so it's taken me a little bit of time to adapt to that sort of process.
But I highly recommend people get their hands on some of the Vinea Marson wines, because I remember back when I was working in King Godfrey as a buyer and I got introduced to the Vinea Marson wines by, of course, yourself. I was really quite blown away with what I consider to be, a more authentic expression of Italian varieties than a lot that I'd seen at that point. And particularly having, since then spent, quite a bit of time traveling around Italy and tasting a lot more Italian wines, I keep kind of referring back to what I think is the great potential, particularly for Sangiovese in Australia. And so I definitely would suggest tracking the Vinea Marson wines down and cracking up in a bottle.
Thanks, James. I think that some of those varieties are well suited to our climate.
Yes.
And I've worked with Sangiovese, but there's a lot of other people that are working with Nero d'Avola, Aglianico, and so there's a whole range of different varieties coming out of Italy that are so adaptable to our climate. So,
and I think, and also, quite suitable to the Australian palate.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And it also gives people that diversity to try different things. So that's great.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Mario. And obviously, I appreciate your time. Tell me, do you know what's the website for Vinea Marson, and what is some of your social media kind of accounts where people can actually follow everything that you're doing?
VineaMarson.com is the
website.
Is the website, and
that's got the contact details.
Exactly. And
Twitter, Instagram is
yes.
at Vinea Marson?
Yes, at Vinea Marson.
Fantastic.
So any of those sites, you'll be able to have the opportunity of trying the Vinea Marson wines.
And Melbourne trade customers, get in touch with our good friend Nazareno from Vinosita.
Exactly, with the ape on the front of his the three-wheeled transport vehicle.
Yes. Well, thank you, Mario, and I look forward to having some more Vinea Marson very soon.
Thank you, James.
As always, guys, thank you very much for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And of course, you can follow me on social media on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Intrepid Wino. And you can also follow the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. If you go to facebook.com/Intrepid Wino, you'll find my Facebook page. And please do go to the Intrepid Wino channel, one word, on YouTube, and subscribe and watch some of the Let's Taste videos, as well as some other videos that I'm going to be putting up very soon. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Player FM, and that way you'll be able to get the new episode as soon as it becomes available and listen to it on your portable device of choice. Of course, come to intrepidwino.com for all of the podcast episodes, lots of different writings, all the YouTube videos, and all the different ways you can get in contact with me, because I love to get some feedback. So send me an email, thevincast@gmail.com. Maybe if you'd like to be on the podcast, let me know, and hope to bump into you soon. I've got some great episodes coming up, but until next time, bye.